Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to continue our story about the pre-revolutionary period. Last time we covered the wave of radicalism surrounding the Stamp Act, and so today we're going to deal with a number of the other fun set pieces of the American Revolution, namely the townshend duties and the aftermath, and then of course the famous Tea Act. So let's dive in and dispel some of the myths that your elementary school teachers taught you, and describe how this whole thing broke out into violence. So here are our objectives for today. Take a moment to note them, and let's dive in. So, as we noted last time, England was attempting to recoup some of the money that they had spent on the French and Indian War by taxing the colonies. Up till this point, their efforts to tax the colonies have gone not great, leading to significant tension, colonial protest, the whole ideology of no taxation without representation, and occasional burning down of the governor's house in Massachusetts. So, the townshend duties were the British next attempt to tax the colonies. As we hopefully remembered from last time, in the aftermath of the repeal of the Stamp Act, the British government reaffirmed their right to tax the colonies through the Declaratory Act. The colonies up to this point had always been somewhat accepting of British taxes on trade, even if they didn't always follow them, and so the British decided that rather than focusing on a single thing like paper, what if instead we spread the tax out into a whole bunch of different things, like tea, glass, lead, paint, and, a little bit of paper. The colonists predictably did not like this and organized their committees of correspondence to start boycotting the affected products, all this stuff, and using mob violence to enforce all of this. John Dickinson wrote his famous Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, basically establishing that, again, no taxation without representation is a thing, and that when the British passed the Stamp Act, they revealed that all of these acts are not about regulating trade, but instead, quote, for the purpose of raising a revenue. And so his argument is, again, that although these taxes appear to be taxes on trade under the basic theory of mercantilism, like we've had since the 1650s, in reality the British are trying to squeeze money out of us, and that's totally not okay. Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, again, there were 12 different letters, widely read and printed, and organized over time growing resistance to the townshend duties. There wasn't an immediate outrage the way there was to the Stamp Act because, of course, on the surface, these taxes seemed relatively small and similar to the Navigation Act that the colonists had previously accepted. But the colonists, over time, built more resistance and eventually started pushing for general non-importation agreements, basically bans on importing all British goods. In Massachusetts, the circular letter laid out these principles, basically saying that, quote, the House further of the opinion that their constituents, considering the local circumstances, cannot by any possibility be represented in the Parliament, and that it will be forever impractical that it should be equally represented there, consequently, not at all, being separated by an ocean of 1,000 leagues. So, 1, no taxation without representation. 2, because of the distance of Parliament, we can never be adequately represented there, so maybe just no taxation. Obviously, the English are not going to be happy about this, but there's very little they can do. The colonists start organizing boycotts and even start talking about non-exportation agreements, which is much harder to get the colonies on board with. In Boston, they're much more successful at pushing for these things because, of course, John Hancock is a merchant and sometimes smuggler. Or mostly, maybe I guess we should say smuggler and sometimes merchant. And Sam Adams, the lawyer, rabble-rouser politician, are great at riling up the crowd. And so Boston pretty quickly gets behind both the non-importation and non-exportation agreements, then tarring and feathering and harassing anyone who breaks/opposes these policies. The event that leads again to significant violence is called the Liberty Incident. The Liberty was a ship of John Hancock's that he may or may not have been smuggling on, and by may or may not we mean yes, he absolutely was. It was searched by a British customs official, but most gallingly for John Hancock, the British customs official didn't even have a writ of assistance. He just forced his way onto the ship, saw the smuggled merchandise, and attempted to seize control of the ship. This led to what's known as the, quote, Liberty Riot, in which the people of Boston seized control of the ship, allowed the Liberty to escape, then went to the custom collector's ship and burned it to the ground. They then, of course, went about attacking other government buildings and again burned the governor's house to the ground for the second time in the span of about 3 years. This led the British to decide that they needed to act. When stories of the Liberty Riot and the burning of the governor's house reached London, they dispatched a battalion of soldiers to Massachusetts in order to restore order. Here's a print by Paul Revere showing the redcoats embarking and coming into Boston. This led to significant tension because, of course, now you've got a bunch of British soldiers wandering around the streets of Boston, and you've got members of the Sons of Liberty who are irritated about them being here. These two groups start fighting with each other and arguing about stuff. The colonists are also upset because in their spare time, these British soldiers take odd jobs and start working for merchants, which takes opportunities away from the Bostonians. And so over time, the tension builds until it becomes the Boston Massacre. The story of the Boston Massacre that I was told from someone dressed in colonial costume, so it absolutely must be true, is that a young kid was walking down the street and trying to impress this girl that he liked who was watching. So he walked by a British soldier and threw out some snarky remarks at him in order to make this girl think he was super cool. The soldier took offense, smacked the kid in the face with his gun. The kid slipped on some ice, fell down, and ran away crying. As the story of this spread, the story that the Bostonians told was that this kid had been attacked unprovoked by these horrible British soldiers, and so quickly a mob formed up to attack this soldier. He then retreated back to the customs house where there were other soldiers waiting, and the mob began throwing ice surrounding the soldiers, menacing them. Eventually, a snowball or a chip of ice hit a soldier, he fell, his gun went off, and then the soldiers started firing into the crowd. Their officer quickly got them under control, but before the incident was over, a number of Americans were killed. Something around the area of 6 Americans were killed and like 7 were wounded. Here's an account of here's the British account of the Boston Massacre. And in the end, the soldiers were put on trial. They were defended by none other than future President John Adams, who ended up getting most of them acquitted on account of the fact that they were under threat of their life. But it didn't matter, because this became a fantastic propaganda win for the colonies. Paul Revere's image of the Boston Massacre began circulating widely, and it led to the repeal of the townshend duties because the British needed to do something to lessen the tension from after the whole massacre thing. So the result is townshend duties repealed, and the central problem of how the heck are we going to pay off all this debt continues to be a problem. So the last and honestly unrelated crisis is sort of an unforced error by the British. The lies that you were told about the Tea Act is that it was a tax on tea. The reality of the Tea Act is it was designed to bail out the East India Company, who was going to be bankrupt by a combination of poor management and corruption. And so the Tea Act gave the East India Company, as it says here, the exclusive right to sell tea in the colonies. They could bypass the tea auctions in London and instead import cheap tea directly to the colonies. On the surface, this looks like a good thing for the colonists. Lots of cheap tea is coming in, but for a lot of American merchants who made their livelihood buying tea in English tea auctions and then selling it off to the colonies, the idea that the British could import tea directly to the colonists cuts them out of the loop and is totally going to destroy their business. There was also a fear that other companies would start doing this and that the colonies would just become a dumping ground for cheap British merchandise, putting all colonial industry out of business. And so a bunch of Native Americans showed up on the dock one day, attacked the ships, destroyed all the tea in the harbor, and dashed away. And so these Native Americans were never found, and all the tea is destroyed, and all the other colonies started to push back and argue and refuse to accept any of this new East India Company tea. England, in response, was not particularly happy with millions of dollars of tea being destroyed, and so they ordered that Boston pay back the money for the tea being destroyed. The Bostonians replied, well, it was those Native Americans. Clearly, we had nothing to do with this. England replied, no, you got to pay us back for the tea. Boston refused, and so English passed what are called the Coercive Acts or the Intolerable Acts. Boston Port Act closes the port. Administration of Justice Act closes down the courts. Massachusetts Government Act closes down the government. Quartering Act forces the Bostonians to pay for the soldiers, and the Quebec Act takes the Ohio River Valley and makes it part of Quebec, giving it to Canada and forever locking the colonists out of it. So all of these pissed off all the colonists, leading to significant propaganda and a military officer named Thomas Gage being made governor of Boston. New England, in response, starts drilling militias and preparing for potential warfare, gathering weapons, stuff like that, and we get all this propaganda of look how horribly the British are treating the Bostonians. All of this leads to the First Continental Congress. A larger version of the Stamp Act Congress, the First Continental Congress, meets in Philadelphia and has 12 of the 13 colonies, sans Georgia, meeting. They agree to a couple different things. They agree that they're going to start petitioning England as a whole group of colonies as opposed to individuals. They agree to aid being sent to Boston, and they agree that they're all going to start creating and training colonial militias just in case this comes to violence. They also create this larger group that replaces the Committees of Correspondence, known as the Continental Association. And so they're going to pass both non-importation and non-exportation agreements. And any colony who refuses, the colonists decide that they're going to boycott goods from them. So, for example, when Delaware balks at a non-importation/exportation agreement, and Rhode Island is also somewhat worried about this, the other colonies tell them, if you bring in British goods, we're going to extend the boycott to you. So eventually everyone's on board. They start training militias, they establish local groups of the Sons of Liberty to enforce this, and the colonists are mostly united in purpose, with the exception of Georgia, the Georgians, who are currently getting massacred by Native Americans, and therefore would desperately like any troops the British would send their way. The race to try to secure weapons and supplies for the militia eventually leads to the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The British dispatch out from Boston to try to capture a stockpile of colonial weapons and gunpowder at Concord. The Sons of Liberty dispatch a series of riders to help warn the colonial militias, known as Minutemen. Paul Revere and two others attempt to go and warn the colonial militias, which they're able to do successfully. The colonists then first meet the British at Lexington and are swiftly defeated by the much more capable British troops. But by the time the British get to Concord, the colonists have fortified the other side of a bridge, the British start taking heavy losses, and as more colonists start flooding in, the British attempt to make the march back to Boston. This march is incredibly difficult for the British as they are attacked repeatedly by colonial militias along the way, and now fighting has started in Massachusetts. The Battle of Lexington is often referred to as the shot heard round the world. And this is the account of the British marching back to Boston. Quote, We set out on our return. We were fired upon from houses, from behind trees, and before we'd gone half a mile, we were fired upon from all sides, but mostly from the rear, where people had hid themselves in houses till we passed and then fired. The country was an amazing one, full of strong hills, woods, and stone walls, which the rebels did not fail to take advantage of, for they were all lined with people who kept up an incessant fire upon us, as we did too upon them, but not with the same advantage, for they were so concealed there was hardly any seeing them. And in this way we marched between 9 and 10 miles, their numbers increasing from all parts, where ours was reduced by deaths, wounds, fatigue, and we were totally surrounded, which such an incessant fire it is impossible to conceive. Our ammunition was likewise near expended. The British then launch a counterattack, attacking colonial forces across the river in Charlestown at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill is important because it's one of the first times that we see a major set-piece battle between the Massachusetts militia and the British troops. The British launched several assaults on Breed's Hill here, where the colonists had actually set themselves up. The colonists are able to show discipline under fire. They repulse 3 different British attacks despite being outnumbered, until finally they run out of ammunition and are forced to withdraw. The Battle of Bunker Hill marks the first major battle of the American War for Independence, and now what the colonists need to decide is this an isolated struggle between the Bostonians and the British, or is this a larger conflict that's going to involve all the colonies? So that's the story that we'll try to figure out next time as the Second Continental Congress prepares to meet. So that's where we'll go from here. Thank you for listening.